New numbers out today show nearly 1.5 million Americans filed for unemployment last week. So what does that number mean? Well, it is higher than we were expecting. It means people are still losing their jobs because of this pandemic. Weekly jobless claims had never hit that million mark before the end of March, and now they just can't seem to fall below it. NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Ruhle is joining me now. And Steph, that weekly number disappointing, but I know you've been watching continuing unemployment claims. That's the total number of people getting paid every week, not just new claims. What are you seeing there?
Here's what's worrisome for us. Remember, there was this idea that we artificially shut down our economy to face this pandemic, but then we were going to turn it right back on. Well, turning the economy back on isn't so easy. Think about reopenings. You've got hotspots like in Texas where you're seeing businesses close again. Apple has closed some of their stores. You've got Disney with many of their employees now signing a petition that they don't feel comfortable going back to work. So the fact that we're continuing to see more and more people go on unemployment every week means that booming snapback you thought we were going to get is going to take quite a bit longer.
Steph, you've also been taking a look at pandemic unemployment assistance claims. How rather are those different from typical claims? What are you seeing there?
Okay, this is hugely important because when the CARES Act was signed, they expanded unemployment benefits. Chuck Schumer called it unemployment on steroids, where you had people that were part of the gig economy, people who are self-employed, now able to get those benefits. They gave more money for a longer period of time, that extra $600. Now, here's the issue. That runs out next month. And I can promise you, the almost 50 million people who are on unemployment, they're not going to be all getting back to work in the next month. So some say, well, this program isn't perfect, but it's a robust program while we have so many people that aren't working and so many businesses still shut down. So there's more and more pressure on both sides of the aisle for Congress to get back to the table and figure out another stimulus package, because when the unemployment benefit runs out, when the PPP money starts to dwindle, you're going to have a lot of people and a lot of businesses in serious need. And it's not just about the individual. Remember, it's consumer spending that drives our economy. And if you've got millions and millions of people with no money to spend, that's going to hurt all levels of business.
Steph, let's talk more about that extra $600 a week that people are getting from the CARES Act. As you said, that is set to run out at the end of July 1st. USA Today reporting, though, that may not be the case. Do we know what's going on there?
Well, they may extend it. But, you know, there are arguments out there that because this unemployment benefit is so robust, there are certain businesses, specifically in certain regions of the country, that have struggled to hire people back because they're getting more financial security because of that benefit. And it's caused some more Republican lawmakers to say, well, people just don't want to go back to work because the unemployment's so good. That is a completely overused statement that, for the most part, isn't true. Remember, we still don't have childcare in a big way. We still don't have schools open. So it's easy to say people are choosing to sit on unemployment. It's a very complicated situation, and we still don't have federal guidelines on safety. And go to your Main Street, wherever you are, and ask those small businesses how much information they're getting from the government. And each one is going to tell you it's really confusing.
Steph, big picture, when we look at today's numbers, when we look at the situation we're in, what does this tell us about where we are as an economy and how far we have to go?
Allison, it tells us there's a long road back. Now, it's not that there are no jobs out there. There are. The demand has shifted. We've talked about this before. We know that bigger businesses, specifically big box stores, have been hiring. You can look at certain industries and they are hiring. Remember, demand shifted. So for those people that are out of work, let's say they work in retail and they're going, how am I possibly going to get a job again? I just got laid off at Macy's and the Gap isn't hiring. The key for people who aren't working is to think about what is your skill set, not what industry were you in and where can that skill set work. People who work in customer service, people who are good problem solvers, there are jobs for a lot of businesses if you've got that skill set. But you got to think creatively. And also, if you're on unemployment, which, as I said, we have almost 50 million people who are, this is a time, if you have the time, to take advantage of free training. Pick your industry. There are online free training courses now more than we've ever seen before. So if you have this time, try to use it wisely, because we're in for a really difficult road, and there's not going to be a snapback or an immediate answer. You got to get creative and constructive.
Steph Ruhle, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.